Okay, let's go through now cylinder, cone, and sphere. All right, so the cylinder, it's a little bit different, obviously, because it's rounded. It's not faceted like this form. So when you look at this division line between the shadow and light, it seems very clear because there's that hard facet there. And over here, it looks like a softer edge, right? Because this is a rounded form. It's not faceted. But where this turns into shadow is just as specific a place as it is here. Okay, the reason it looks kind of blurry along that edge is because the light is darkening, darkening, darkening. As it goes away from the light's going to darken. So you have a darker light up against your shadow's edge. So that's why it looks soft, like a softer edge. But it's important to keep in mind that where that shadow starts, it's a very specific place, and that's where we start on the cylinder. So when I look at that cylinder, I think about a halfway mark, and I ask myself, is there more or less, am I seeing more or less half shadow? And I'm seeing less. So my shadow line is starting over here. So I just draw that line in and block in the tone as I did with the rectangular solid. Really important to be very specific about this edge. Like, this is going to look flat at the beginning, and that's okay. It's going to be important later when we start creating a gradation to know exactly where the start of the shadow is against the light. So you can't sort of fudge it and sort of put in your shadow like this where you have an indeterminate kind of outline to it. You want to be very, very definite. Now, you don't want to put in so hard a line that it's hard to erase later, but you want to put in a very definite boundary line. Okay, and then my cast shadow starting here as before, and the whole thing is sort of running uphill. Again, map in my cast shadow shape. Again, as you're putting in your values, it's really important to do what's called blocking, which is making sure that your value is simple and even, doesn't have a lot of different stripes of value running through it. You know, at this stage, what we're trying to do is put in a single average for light, or for the form shadow, for the cast shadow here. So again, this is my form, this is my cast shadow. Okay. Then as the light moves, the shadow on a cylinder is going to stay parallel to the edge. So it's just going to march across like this. It doesn't matter what I do with the light. If I go up or low or do whatever, it's just going to march horizontally across that form. And it's always going to stay parallel to the edge on a true cylinder. And so it would just, as I move the light back around, it would just sort of march like this around the form. All right, that's a cylinder. All right, the cone is, I don't have a cone, so I'm just going to show you what happens here. The cone is kind of like a cylinder in that it's rounded. The big difference is that the shadow line is always running oblique to the edge. In other words, towards or away from it, however you want to think of it. It's not parallel. So when we have a tapering form that's rounded, we want to think about that, that shadow line is running towards, or again, either towards or away, however you want to think of it, but oblique to the edge. So my cast shadow moving uphill like this. Again, blocking the tone. You don't want to get ahead of yourself. You want to kind of keep things definite in terms of the shapes. That's really important. It continues to be important now as we move away from those reflective or see-through forms that we did the last two exercises. The idea of keeping tone and shape maintains its importance. It continues to be really critical to think about making a shape with a tone, not just putting down some blurry kind of cotton candy-ish shape that doesn't have any kind of a discernible boundary to it. You want to establish a boundary first, and then once it's there, then you can soften it later and still maintain a shape. Okay. So on a cone, as the light goes around to the back, it's going to sort of march like this, right? It's always going to stay not parallel to the edge as its shadow runs around, goes around. Okay. Then on a sphere, and this is a really important form, the sphere is, because it's the one that we are most interested in if we draw organic things like the human figure. Because at the end of the day, everything on the human figure is rounded in every direction. So it's important to understand how light works on a spherical form. And I'm going to give you three different variables to keep in mind as you're doing the sphere. So the first situation is when the light source is in front of the object, kind of the way we're doing with these. Again, I don't have a sphere, so I'm just going to have to show it to you. But in that situation, with the light source above, right, and in front, what we're going to see is we're going to see a concave curve. So a curve that runs like this. And the axis of that curve, in other words, if I draw a line between the endpoints, the axis is going to be at a right angle to the line of sight, or to the direction of light, sorry. So the light source is coming like this. Here's my axis, so there's my curve. So as the light moves up this way, this whole thing would sort of shift this way. It would still stay concave as long as the light source stayed in front. All right. So there's my shadow shape with the light in front of the object. I'm going to always have more light, less shadow when that's the case, when the light source is in the front. The cast shadow, it's a little bit different with a sphere because here the edge of the shadow doesn't meet the ground plane. It's the shadow hits the ground plane, but not this edge. So I'm going to get kind of a distorted elliptical shape here, but the whole thing again is going to move slightly uphill, right? Because the light source is around to the front. So whatever shape I see, I just want to keep in mind that the axis of that shape is going to move slightly uphill, because the light source is around to the front. Okay. The second situation is when the light starts moving behind the object, but it's not behind it yet. It's on the same plane as the object. So the light and the object are sort of on the same plane in terms of where they are relative to me. So with that, what happens there is this line will become less and less curved until that point where the object and the light source are at the same plane in space for me, and then I'm going to get a straight line. So when I see half light, half shadow on a true sphere, my shadow line is going to turn from a curve. It's going to slowly, as the light source goes around, it's going to slowly flatten out and become a straight line, which is counterintuitive to us. You know, we think of a rounded object. We don't think of the shadow line as being a straight line, but that's what happens when you get the situation of half light, half shadow. And when that's the case, this cast shadow is going to have a horizontal aspect to it. Instead of tilted up, if it's coming from the side, the axis of that cast shadow is going to be a horizontal. So with all these shapes, again, make sure that you guys at least once go through and draw what I'm drawing so that you become familiar with these shapes. Okay, the last situation, and probably the least intuitive, is when the light source is on the other side of the object, of the sphere. So here, it's still above. Here it's above. This is the side view, and this is behind. And the light source is behind the object. And when that's the case, then I'm going, instead of getting a concave curve, I'm going to have a convex curve. And I'm going to see more shadow than light on the object. This is the one that people miss the most. Because for some reason, this idea seems firmly ingrained in our idea of what a curve on a rounded surface looks like, but this one is a little less intuitive. And then the cast shadow in this situation, since the light's behind, the cast shadow is going to drop down and move towards us. Downhill, run downhill on the page. So that's what the light source behind. All right, so what you're never going to see is at least in a single light source situation, you're not going to see anything like this. You're not going to see a sphere like this, because here the problem with this is I have a concave curve relative to light source, but I'm showing more shadow than light, and that doesn't happen. You're always going to have more light than shadow, so that's not going to happen. People, this is a fairly common sort of mistake that I see when people are in this position. They want to make the curve like this. All right, you're also never going to see anything like this. Again, at least with just a direct light situation and not a cast shadow situation. You're not going to see this because here I've got a concave curve relative to the direction of the light source, but I've got more light than shadow. So when I get the concave curve, you're always going to have more shadow than light, so we're not going to see that either. All right, so with these ideas, I'm going to assign a fairly simple light shadow drawing exercise for you. That I want you to use these ideas and apply them to that drawing. Okay.